Good morning, everyone. I don't know if I'm also one of the dinosaurs, but I've been doing this for more than 10 years, so I think I qualify, perhaps. It's with great pleasure that I'm welcoming Professor Sachs, who is coming to us from the Columbia Climate School. She is a director of their Center for Sustainable Investment. And this is the opportunity to have perhaps a less technical and wider, and in the good sense academic, conversation about sustainable finance, and perhaps to give us a different and alternative view of what we're doing well, what we may be missing. Lisa and I have actually had really interesting conversations leading up to this. And we've got sort of 15 minutes to cover a wide variety of topics. And starting with the fundamentals, what I wanted to ask you, Lisa, is can finance actually be sustainable? Are we right in referring to sustainable finance?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here. And I was going to say what you said, which is the best part about being here is the long conversations you and I have had, and then thinking with exasperation how we condense this into 15 minutes. So I've been very grateful for those conversations. I think to try to be succinct on this, the concept of sustainable finance is a confused concept, and it collapses and confuses a lot of distinct objectives. I've written about that, and I have another paper coming out very shortly that I think will be of interest to others. And by the way, the confusion and the conflation in the sustainable finance space means that a lot of the frameworks and the tools and the approaches we've developed reflect that confusion and embed that confusion. And my perception is that that's of great frustration to many of the practitioners also, that it's not just an academic perception of this. To speak just of climate in particular, I think we collapse some major distinctions. First, and I've written a little bit about this too, first the concept of planetary harms, which is the effect of climate change itself and what drives the underlying hazards, and then how those impacts transmit to economic impacts and how some of those transmit into financial markets. And then there are many different important policy responses to that. Fundamentally, the only way to reduce the underlying hazard is mitigation and decarbonizing the global economy. But we also are investing in resilience, in loss sharing. Financial institutions need to manage their own exposure to that risk, fiscal stability, financial system stability. Those are distinct objectives, and they require different institutions with different instruments and tools, and we've largely confused and collapsed a lot of those. So I think the concept of sustainable finance is not even a useful concept anymore because it doesn't help us understand what each of those objectives requires in the first place, what the roles are of different institutions to achieve those, and by the way, also where there might be trade-offs or complexities that have to be managed. So, and maybe I'll add one more point and then stop on this, which is that the underlying, in climate space in particular, mitigation requires systems change. That cannot be achieved within any entity level boundary. It can't be achieved by a corporate on its own, can't even be achieved by a government on its own. And on top of all of our instruments and frameworks, a lot of them build on this concept of entity level target setting, disclosures, which fundamentally misunderstands how systems change happens. So that, I would say, is another complexity we have to manage, or confusion we have to manage in this space. And when we go into the broader concepts of sustainable development, it becomes even more complicated when we go outside of climate change to think about poverty and health and education. But you can imagine how all of those complexities become even more important, but also confused.
So in that context, and this is, obviously, so you're not as embedded as we are in the sustainable bond market, and as you heard from the previous panel, there's a sort of general feeling that nothing's perfect, but the green bond market has sort of done what it was supposed to do, i.e. financing at scale, particularly the energy transition. And what's nice now is that it's not just about climate. We mentioned it's also about resilience, about strategic autonomy. So there's a whole further sort of rationale to this. But again, with your external view, I mean, do you think that our optimism about what the sustainable bond market is doing is validated? Are we doing things which are are relevant, not just from a market perspective, but in terms of trying to achieve these wider goals of climate mitigation and perhaps, again, other new objectives.
One thing I've really appreciated in speaking to you personally is your own reflection on the market and what has or hasn't been working well and where it might go. I think I fit squarely in that space too, which is, I think there have been good things that have been achieved, which I can speak to, but I think that a lot more usefully could be done, and I think that it's worthwhile to reflect on it. What I think it has usefully done is, within the limitations I already described of the fact that we shouldn't even be thinking in terms of corporate boundaries or even government boundaries, but I think it has been useful to encourage entities to think about what they can do constructively. And as you've taught me actually, the labeled debt market has pushed that type of thinking more than some of our other labeled frameworks and taxonomies and so on, and much more thoughtfully to think about what does it really look like for an entity to think about what it can achieve, and then to commit to that over successive leadership generations and so on. So that is useful. The limitations of that should be recognized though, which is that no entity can achieve. Resilience is different because entities can think of their own resilience, but not societal resilience. That's a different thing. But we should understand the limitations of any entity level plan. And the fact that, as we've all recognized, the current approaches are imperfect. What I think this could grow to, though, is that we do need a different reallocation of finance. So if we could start from the point of how do we actually think about what are the transitions that are needed and what are the ways in which we can think about different pools of financing for that, and then think about how do we issue debt on those tools, then I think that there's much more opportunity for the debt market to help actually accelerate new financing, which I'm not sure that this current approach does, to where real financing is needed.
Yeah, I mean, again, rebounding on the previous conversations, one of the challenges that the market faces is to what extent can we go into the novel area of transition defined as something which supports the goals of the Paris Agreement but doesn't fit in the green concept and doesn't cross over to greenwashing or transition washing. And that's a narrow path, as you heard, and we're still very much experimenting. And the other point that you made, which I round in something I said, and I'm grateful you took it up, is we've had this discussion about sustainable bond market in terms of what it actually achieves. And I think the point that has been missed very often is that it creates a very significant and effective accountability mechanism for corporate strategies. It's one deal, of course. It is what it is. The deal gets paid down. But I think, as the representative from Q&B says, the experience remains, but not only the experience and the know-how, but again, the commitment of the company to a sustainable strategy is a lot firmer when the markets are looking, and particularly when the fixed income markets are looking. Now, moving to another topic, you've just published, I thought, a really interesting paper on a proposal, co-authored a paper for a proposal of a guarantee facility for decarbonization. And so, this sort of sounds like a new multilateral initiative. We discussed the Green Climate Fund, which has been in existence for more than a decade, which, with no disrespect to the Green Climate Fund, I don't think it's been especially effective. We also have had initiatives embedded in various multilaterals. So what is your concept, and what would it achieve that isn't done, and how would it not, again, suffer the fate of some of the previous multilateral initiatives?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time trying to understand what has worked and what hasn't, and so how we can build from that. My starting point, so just to say, and I understand where this has come from and why it has happened, but I think in the financial markets, we start with the instrument and what do we recognize in the financial markets that we can apply to the challenge or the solution. I start from the other way around, which is what are we trying to achieve in real world outcomes? What needs to happen? Or why is that not happening? What are the barriers to the reallocation of capital that's needed, and how might we address that? In many cases, not all, in many cases, first of all, capital is not the constraint. Technology is no longer the constraint. That's amazing. That was not true when we started this work. what is now really the barrier is, first of all, the systems change takes coordination, multi-actor coordination, and often it's the misallocation of risks, and how real risks, not climate-related risk, but risks like currency risk and first-of-a-kind technology risk and more off-take risk, and how those are allocated. Because right now we group them together a lot in risk assessments, and then they become non-financeable or they're too expensive. So we've been thinking about how we can better allocate risks in different types of financing needs so that the underlying project or investment or borrower becomes financeable. So the paper that you referred to was looking at industrial decarbonization in particular, which is really feasible actually, but in many different contexts, there are these specific risks that if we could reallocate or guarantee those risks, then the underlying project becomes financeable. So we suggested a model that could pool those types of risks, but that the guarantees are specific to the projects. That is one example of a mechanism that could pool risk. It's one example of a pooled financial mechanism that could really help to address some of the systemic constraints. And to me, that's exactly the type of instrument that could then borrow. We talked about this in terms of the Green Climate Facility, which for all of its flaws, and I know it's been a challenge, it can't even borrow, which really undermines its ability to leverage. You taught me about the IFM, which I then looked into and saw exactly the mechanism that you can have a pooled financing mechanism.
IFM, by the way, is the immunization facility, which is financed vaccine bonds. And vaccine bonds, and I see some people in the audience nodding, René Cassanti, who was involved. That was, if anything, if we want to look at what was the birth of the sustainable bond market as we know it today, it was probably the vaccine bonds issued by IFM. But sorry.
No, it's a perfect example of how the bond is issued against an instrument that can actually finance a system. That's so different, by the way, and it's really important in this space because it allows the instrument to think in terms of the system. And I would add one more point, which is that what's possible in systems change is evolving. And now a lot of the benefits from a climate perspective or from any perspective come from things that are optimizing for something else, for efficiency or for convenience or for transport. So we don't even call those sustainable when and my center is called the Center on Sustainable Investment. I don't even use that word because of how confused it can be, but we don't identify that as something that we want to finance for the transition when some of these investments in efficiency or flexibility or reliability are actually the most profoundly impactful in terms of emissions reduction. So when we can look at something as a system and it gives us that flexibility and the agility to recognize what is needed to optimize the system and to be able to lend to that affordably and at scale, I think would have a real impact.
Can you walk us through the risks which you think need to be addressed by this facility?
Yeah, so that's a great, in this particular context, we were looking at industrial decarbonization because again, largely the technology we know and the pathways we know. This is for what are called hard to abate sectors in general. But unlike solar panels, where once the technology improves, it can scale rapidly everywhere. In industrial decarbonization, it's very context specific what makes a project financeable at scale. Sometimes it's the volatility of it's not even the price of the energy, but the volatility of the energy market or the first of a kind technology risk or an offtake risk or utilization risk or something that is specific in a particular context. Those who understand these markets understand them pretty well. So I like the idea of mechanisms. First of all, I like guarantees in general because many of these projects can be financeable, but it's just that the risks are either misunderstood or can't be carried. So guarantees can be very effective, low-cost mechanisms for those who really understand the projects and can understand their viability, can say, we're good for this technology is viable. So in that particular context, it's looking at those specific risks. But we've thought about guarantee funds for instance, cities financing, because cities can't access finance. Many cities can't access finance without sovereign guarantees or at all. So what are the cases in which financing isn't flowing because there are limitations or perceived risks, currency risk, offtake risk in general, that if we could think about pooled guarantee mechanisms with the technical expertise that can understand the underlying financing can really unlock some of those barriers. And so I think this is one model that could be scaled more generally.
Yeah. So you could have like a dedicated team backed by multilateral, focusing on decarbonization, getting expertise, and then we can back this with green bonds, climate transition bonds. It could issue guarantees. Again, it sounds very familiar with again, other things which have worked. So food for thought. I see we're up for time. Professor Sachs, thank you so much for joining us, giving us a different perspective and coming up with this interesting proposal, and to be continued.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.